Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today with Landon Blake, who will present Practical Management of Field Surveys. Landon is a land surveyor working in Central California. He lives with his wife in Stockton and is the founder of Redefined Horizons, a small surveying company that focuses on private real estate. Landon, thank you for joining us today. I will hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Hi, guys. Thanks for signing up for the webinar. Appreciate that. We're going to talk today about management of field surveys. So, I've bounced around a lot since I got licensed. I've been at a half a dozen or so places since I got licensed. So that's been a painful experience, but it's allowed me to see the different ways that surveying organizations manage their field work. And so I've learned a lot. And at all of those places I've been since I've gotten licensed, the management of fieldwork has always been a major challenge and a pain point. And so I've thought a lot about why that is, and I've spent a lot of time working with my bosses and the owners of these firms to try and eliminate some of those pain points. And so part of what I wanted to do in today's workshop is share with you guys some of the things that I've learned just from managing fieldwork at different organizations. So I've worked at small companies, I've worked at 10-person companies, I've worked at 500-person companies, I've worked at companies that do mostly private work, I've worked at companies that do mostly public work. I work for union firms, I work for non-union firms, and that definitely has an impact on how you manage your field work. So I want to go through some of the things that I've learned and share those with you, and hopefully you guys will benefit from that. So a couple disclaimers I just want to put out here right at the beginning. I'm not a wizard, and I don't have all the answers. So, I'm going to give you some suggestions today, but every surveying organization is different, and every field survey is a little bit different. So I'm not trying to lay down any rules. So, take everything I say today with a grain of salt. I'm going to try and keep a good sense of humor about this. I'm going to probably poke fun at some different people in some different categories of surveyor. So don't get offended. Don't take me too seriously. I want to keep this light and keep it fairly fun. We will talk about responsible charge a little bit, which is, I hope we have time to do that, which is very serious. But that's probably the only serious thing that I hope to talk about. Everything else I hope to keep fairly light. So bear with me and don't get offended at my jokes. And this is hard, guys. Management of fieldwork it's a hard thing to do, especially as the size of your team increases and the size of the organization increases. It gets exponentially harder to manage fieldwork. And so, one of the things that I want to point out right here at the beginning is, if you're like me now, I work at a 4-person firm, and I as the licensed surveyor am on the ground for every field survey we do. That makes it really easy to manage field work. Most surveyors do not have that privilege, and for the last 15 years of my career, I have not had that privilege. So, over the last 15 years, I would say since well before I was licensed, I've rarely had the opportunity to be out in the field. In fact, that was the exception, not the rule. And when you're the LS and responsible charge and you're not in the field every day or on every job at least, there's a lot of extra challenges that come into play. So if you're just running a small shop, you've got a 1-man or 2-man or maybe 4-person shop, and you're the LS, you're out in the field a lot, then a lot of this may not apply to you, and I won't be offended if you jump off the webinar at this point. I think you may pick up some nuggets here and there, but this is really made for people that are working at larger organizations where there's a different group of people doing the field work than are doing the office work, and like, how do you coordinate that, and how do you communicate well, and how do you hold people accountable? That's kind of what this is about. All right, so let's go ahead and move through the slides. So we talked a little bit about who I am and some of my background. I'm running a little firm now in Central California, and like I said, I'm on the ground for most of my field work, so that's great. I appreciate being able to do that. As I mentioned, field work it's hard to manage field work. There's multiple ways to do it. The responsibilities that you assign a crew versus the office staff, there's different ways you can mix up those those tasks. So I don't have the only solution or the only answers. Here's a nice quote that I like. I put this at the beginning of a lot of my presentations. So is know the rules well so you can break them effectively. So I'm going to give you some kind of guidelines here, some suggestions, some best practices. You know, you should understand the rules before you break them. That's kind of the point of the quote, right? So I'm not saying you got to do it this way, but I think there's some value in understanding how I do things and how these other firms I've worked at have done things. And we'll talk about some of the different ways they've done things. And it's good to understand that. That's one of the benefits I've gotten from working at some different companies and seeing how they manage their field work. All right, so why is this important? You know, some guys might say, well, we still do field surveys. Wait, like that's so 1985. You know, yeah, we do still do for field surveys, and I would argue that field surveys are like that's a critical part of what we do. Like that's where everything. And it's not where everything starts necessarily. You start with a scope of services, you know, a proposal and a scope of services and a contract. But you know, this is the field surveys where the rubber hits the road, right? Like that's where the first real work starts getting done. And like if you dork up your field work, you're hosed. Like that's gonna mess everything else up. That's the foundation, right? And you know, we are given the responsibilities that we are given by society because we're supposed to be expert measurement makers, right? And where does that measuring happen? It happens in the field. You know, we make expert measurements in the field, and obviously we do some calculations in the office, and you know, we might be comparing. If you're doing a boundary survey, you might be comparing record to measured in the office, but the actual act of measurement that we perform is out on the ground, right? So field surveying is still really important. You know, I tell people the world is not yet a giant survey grade point cloud. Now, we've been automating more field work and we're doing less and less field work to accomplish the same work product as technology improves, but we're not at the point cloud singularity yet, right? And I think we're a long way from that. So field work is still going to be a really important part of what we do. And in this particular webinar, I'm not going to dive into details on different types of field surveys just because of the limits of time. So, you know, it may be in the future, maybe we'll have a webinar on, you know, field work for boundary surveys or field work for elevation certificates. You know, we might look at specifics. So I'm going to try and keep this general so that it's applicable to different types of surveys. But as an example of how important field work can be, you know, if you're doing a field survey for a boundary resolution, a large part of the fieldwork, a critical part of the fieldwork is evaluating the evidence in the field, right? What's the physical occupation like? What kind of monuments did you find? You know, what condition are they in? Do they match the record character? Do they look like they're in the right position? And so you have to be really careful how you delegate and assign that work, because if that fieldwork is not done properly, things are going to get goofed up. And I'll give you a couple. I'll try and weave in some personal examples here when I can. So let me give you a couple quick examples of how important the fieldwork is. So I'll give you one where I messed up, and then I'll give you an example from a mistake that was made at a former employer of mine, they will remain anonymous. But so I was working on a job at a university. They were redoing their Olympic pool, and so I was assigned to do the topo. So my crew chief went out, did the topo, and went to the civil engineer, and the civil engineer did a set of design plans, and they go to do construction. And I forget exactly how the problem was discovered, but we realized that the pool was, I don't know, it was about 6/10 too deep, deeper than it was supposed to be. And so there was a big ruckus, and I spent 2 days trying to figure out what happened. And here's what happened. Here's what I found out. So my crew chief went out. There were a number of benchmarks on the campus, supposed to be a number of benchmarks on the campus. We looked for, I don't know, half a dozen or 10 of them. We only found one. We could only find one benchmark. The rest have been destroyed. But we were trying to get on the vertical datum at the university. So my crew chief shot that benchmark, and it went to the survey tech, and they used the surveys. They used the field surveyor's elevation on that benchmark to set the survey. Now, here's what happened. When the crew chief shot the monument, the description in his notes just said MON, Mon. That was it. That's all I got. And I don't know if he told the office surveyor this or not. He may have, he may not have. The office surveyor may have forgotten, but the lid on the Monwell was jammed shut and he couldn't get it open. So he didn't understand that we were shooting that survey as a benchmark. And so if you're doing a boundary, then a shot on the center of the lid's better than nothing. So he shot the center of the lid, which in this case was absolutely the wrong thing to do, because he didn't give a good description of the monument and he didn't indicate in his field notes or communicate to the office surveyor that he couldn't get on the actual benchmark itself. The office surveyor held the top of the lid for the elevation, and that's why we were whatever 5/10 or 6/10 too deep on the pool. And so what happened in that situation is the contractor bring fill back in and compact it, and my company spent $50,000 on a change order. Now, and I had to own that. That was my mistake. Now there were multiple points of failure there, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about multiple points of failure, but ultimately as the LS and responsible charge of the work, I had to own that. So fieldwork's really important. I'll give you another quick example of a company that I used to work for. They were doing some construction surveying, and I'm not sure exactly what happened, if the error was so we did the design topo and the civil engineering plans, and then another company staked the actual building, and I don't know who made the actual error, if it was our crew or the staking company's crew, but in essence what happened is they only shot one benchmark, so they didn't check their benchmark elevation, and something had happened with the benchmark. There was a problem, it had been disturbed, and so they ended up with a building that was it ended up being like 2 feet too tall. And the area this was being built was in the Bay Area and a very restrictive land use code. And so they lost the top floor of this skyscraper. And the lawsuit from that mistake was $5 million. That was the amount of money the building owner was trying to go after. So think about that for a second. One simple mistake, a failure to check a second benchmark could cost $5 million. That's why this field work is so important, right? And here's what I tell my guys a lot. We're going to talk in a few minutes about kind of a typical workflow, but I always tell my guys, don't just fall out of your friggin' truck and grab your tools and start surveying. Like, leave your tools in the truck, get out of the truck, grab your rodman, and walk that site with no tools in your hands. Walk the site. Think about how you're going to execute, where you're going to put the control, if there's safety hazards that you need to worry about, where the utilities might be, if there's anything that looks funny that you need to call me about, right? Then after you've taken 15 or 20 or 30 minutes to walk the site, then go back and get your tools, right? Because my guys are always in too much of a hurry to just grab their tools and start working. Okay, so I'm trying to get them to think about what they're doing. So I've got a slide. I don't think I put it in here, so let me pull it up real quick for you guys. So I just want to talk for a minute about points of failure. So this is an extra slide that didn't make it into the slideshow. So if you think about the typical surveying organization from the perspective of, starting at the rodman and going up to the client. And so here we've got the rodman, we've got the party chief, we got the survey technician. So this could be a survey tech, maybe it's a land surveyor, or an LSIT, it could be an LSIT that's working for the land surveyor and responsible charge. And then over here, we got the client. Well, each one of these interface points, each one of these touch points is a potential point of failure, right? So the client might not tell the LS what he really needs. The LS may not explain to the client what needs to be done. The LS may not explain to the tech, how the topo needs to be drafted. The tech may not ask the LS when he's got questions. The rodman may not understand the task he's assigned by the party chief. So these are all potential points of failure that you need to think about. But in my experience, this is always the critical point of failure right here, right? Most common point of failure, if there's a problem on the survey, is basically this seam right here between office and field, right? This is where everything breaks down. And it could be the way the office is assigning the field work to the crew. It could be the product that the crew is bringing back from the field, but this is the critical point of failure, right? And so this is what we want to worry. This is what we want to worry about. Now, that's kind of what this workshop is about: is how do you address this touch point right here between office and field, this common point of failure. All right, let's get back into our slides. Okay, so we talked about who I am. We got to know the rules before we break them. Yep, we still do field surveys. All right, so part of what we want to make sure that our crews understand is that, and all, not only our crews, but our office techs that are managing this field work often, is don't try and improvise unless you already know the basics, right? Like, you have to understand the basic principles of field surveying. Okay, and then my version of this quote is, don't just fall out of your truck with your tools and start surveying, right? That's why that site walk to me is so important in the beginning. Okay, so what could possibly go wrong on a field survey, right? The answer, everything can go wrong. Okay, so you could have control monuments that have been disturbed. You could be missing property corner monuments. You could have measurements that get busted. You could have raw data that gets corrupted. You could have field notes that you can read. You could have a crew that comes back with no field photos. You could have your surveyor drown or get hit by a car, right? Like, all of those problems I just listed to you, I have experienced in the last 2 decades, right? Every single one, and some that aren't on the list, right? And like, if you talk to any surveyor that's been around for any length of time, they're going to tell you the same thing. I was just talking to a friend of mine who was on a job site working as a one-man crew and got hit by a piece of heavy equipment, right? Could have killed him. He's okay, but like, everything can go wrong. If it can go wrong in a field survey, at some point it won't. I mean, at some point it will go wrong. So what does that mean? That means you got to have good procedures in place to deal with the things that might go sideways, right? That's critical. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? Oh, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. Oh, and I just realized I got you guys on the wrong side. Sorry. All right, we talked about how fieldwork is the foundation, right? Foundation of everything we do. So I got a little diagram here for you guys, right? So here's fieldwork, right? The top 2/3 here of what we do: processing, analysis, calculations, and the creation of work products. This top part of the tower here depends on this bottom square, right? If this bottom square gets knocked out, if there's a problem with the foundation, the top 2 squares here are going to fall over, right? So that's what we're trying to avoid. Everything we do as surveyors is dependent on the field work. Okay, so here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about three things. We're going to talk about how can you prepare for field surveys. We're going to talk about some tips for how you execute field surveys. We're going to talk about responsible charge, written guidelines, and a basic workflow for every field survey. Okay, and then we're going to talk about how do you review field surveys. Okay, now there's some things that we're not going to talk about today because I don't have time, and we may cover some of these topics in a future webinar, but we're not going to talk about specific types of field surveys. I wanted to talk about field drawings today. I'm not going to be able to do that. I realized I don't have time, but I do want to teach you guys about field drawings at some point in the future. We're not going to talk today about using GIS to manage your field surveys. I think that's a really cool tool, especially for bigger organizations. There was a presentation by a surveyor that works for Caltrans District 4, did a really good job of showing us how he uses a GIS system to manage field work, which I think is awesome. We're not going to talk about that today. I'm not going to get into what a field coordinator is and how you design that role, but I think that's important. I'm not going to talk about how you can set systems up to manage your field notes. We'll talk a little bit about field notes, but I'm not going to get into the details. And we're going to talk about review of raw data and why that's important, but we're not going to get into the mechanics. So, maybe in a future webinar, I can get into Trimble Business Center and show you guys. I have a defined process that I use to review my raw data at the same 6 steps every single time. And it's something that it's easy to teach to your techs, and it just catches all kinds of problems. So we're not going over that today. All right, so here's the 3 things we're going to cover: how to prepare for a field survey, how do you execute a field survey properly, and how do you review? How do you do QA, QC, peer review on your field surveys? Those are the 3 things we're going to talk about. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead. See if I can get my slides to work. So we're going to talk about preparing for field surveys first. Okay, so I have just a couple things I want to mention here about this. The first is I really think it's important for the licensed surveyor and responsible charge to have a role in preparing for the field surveys. Now, that doesn't mean he needs to do all the technical work, but here's what I think he needs to do at a minimum. At a minimum, the licensed surveyor and responsible charge needs to be having a conversation with the project surveyor, the project manager, about what needs to be done. Okay, and ideally that conversation includes a review of the scope of services, right? The schedule, the budget, but especially the scope of services. And part of that conversation needs to be how the land surveyor in responsible charge expects the field work to be executed, right? That's really, really important. Okay, so what methods are acceptable given this client, this project, this spec that we have to meet, right? So the topo that you do for a land title survey, that may use different methods than the topo that you do for a conceptual site plan, right? Or for ADA improvements to sidewalk, right? Those all are going to require different things and different methods in the field. So the licensed surveyor should not be leaving that up to the tech. He should be having a conversation about that. And we'll talk a little bit more about written guidelines and how they can sometimes take the place of some of those conversations. So here's the next most important thing to remember about preparing for field surveys. And if you don't take anything else away from this webinar, I hope this is the one thing you take. Instructions for field surveys should always be provided to the crew in writing, period, no exceptions, right? I really strongly believe that. Now, I've worked with party chiefs in the past, guys with 10 or 15 or 20 years of experience, and they're like rock stars. And like, you hand them an address and like they bring you back a topo and a boundary, right? Like there's guys that can do that, but there's not very many of them. So most of your party chiefs are going to need very detailed written instructions on what their assignment is and how you expect them to do it, okay? And here's why written instructions are so important. They're important because you can't hold people accountable without written instructions. Okay, now let me explain that for a minute. So I went to work at a place and I was running a team. I was running a team of 20 people, and we had all kinds of problems. And here's what would happen to me. The project surveyors that I had running the work would blame the field crews. And the field crews would blame the project surveyors, right? So the project surveyor would say, well, the field crew didn't do what I told them. And the field crew would say, well, the project surveyor never told me that. Right? And it's like running a preschool. So like, how do you manage that as a supervisor, right? You gotta get stuff in writing, right? The instructions to the field crew have to be in writing. And once those instructions are written down, here's what that allows you to do. Now you don't have to argue about it, right? Hey, project surveyor, you didn't tell the field crew to dip that manhole. It's not in your instructions. Or field crew, the project surveyor did tell you to look for that property corner. It's right here in your written instructions and you didn't do it, right? You can't hold people accountable if you don't have those instructions or in writing. So here's what I've learned. When I went to Odell Engineering, I was taught about field packages, which I think is a great thing to do. And so a field package is essentially a set of written instructions for the field crew, right? So every place I've been since I worked at Odell, we prepare a field package for every field survey. Every field survey, no exceptions. Every field survey gets a field package, right? So what goes into a field package? So I'm going to give you 5 things that I think need to go in the field package. This is the written set of instructions that are going from the office surveyor to the field crew. So here's what needs to be in there. A survey plan exhibit. Okay, and I'll talk about that, what that is. I've got a slide to show you, but in my office, that's an 11 by 17 exhibit with an aerial background, the mapping limits, notes about site access, notes about safety, notes about control, some brief instructions on the methods that I want to have followed. That goes out on each and every field survey. You never leave my office without a survey plan, period, right? And like I would have guys fight me on this. Like I would have office surveyors just fight me tooth and nail. And I'll tell you why, because they were lazy. They were lazy and they didn't want to take 2 hours or 3 hours to put together a package, right? and they would fight me on it. They would try and send the field crew out with a napkin sketch, right? And here's what I would tell those guys, those project surveyors that would want to send a crew out with a napkin sketch because they were lazy. I'd tell those guys, if you send a crew out with a napkin sketch, be prepared to get a plate full of dog poop in return. Like, I am not going to make the field crew bring you back a Cadillac if you're handing them a napkin sketch, period, right? Like, the field crew deserves a good handoff. They can't do their job without a good handoff. And you can't let your office surveyors be lazy. They have a responsibility to get those field crews a good handoff, right? That's part of the reason why you want it in writing. And part of that is a survey plan with an exhibit, right? And I even had some of the owners and executive managers at companies that were, they come and they bust my chops. Hey, why is it taking 2 hours to prepare a survey plan for this field survey? And here's what I would tell those guys. Here's what I would tell those people. Two things. I would tell them, number one, we're going to spend 2 hours of a survey tech in the office because it's way cheaper than having to send a 2-man field crew back to a job site. Number one. So you're trying to pinch pennies and you're going to spend dollars because you're foolish. Number one. Number two, if you're asking me to sign this work product and to be in responsible charge of this field work, you're spending the 2 hours on the field survey plan because that's what I feel I need to do as a licensed surveyor to be in responsible charge, right? And listen, licensed surveyors in my audience, sometimes owners don't like hearing that, especially owners that aren't licensed surveyors, right? But it's like, you got to stand up for yourself and you got to explain, if I'm going to be in charge, responsible charge of the field work, I need some control, and there are standards that have to be followed, right? So you need to put in a survey plan exhibit. You need to put in a copy of the current control. You need the copy of the current site calibration. If there's a site calibration, man, site calibrations cause all kinds of problems. So you got to be careful with those. You need information on the current coordinate reference system. Are you state plane? What zone are you in? Are you ground? Are you grid? Should the crew be running a scale factor? Yes or no, right? Where do they set their base, right? All those things need to be provided. You need copies of any of the documents that are needed by the field crew, right? So for example, if they're doing a boundary survey, they need copies of all the record maps, all the filed survey maps, all the corner records, right? They need a copy of the vesting deed. Maybe they need a copy of the title report. Okay, if they're doing a construction survey, they need a copy of the current plans, right? They need the last as-built survey that was done. They need a copy of the cut sheet that you think you're going to give to the contractor. Okay, and the fourth thing they need is a site contact. Your crew always needs a site contact, okay? And they need a contact in your office. In other words, if they run into a problem, if somebody shows up with a shotgun, right, they need to know who to call. Who in the office do they call for help? Okay, so those are the 5 things. I'm going to run through them again real quick. Survey plan exhibit, copy of the current control, information about coordinate systems, copies of other docs that they might need, a site contact, and an office contact. Okay, now you put all that together. Should you check your field package? Yes, you should have a checklist. What goes into a field package, right? And you need to make sure that your office surveyors are providing that. And I make them fill out the checklist and sign it so that I can hold them accountable. Hey, where's your survey plan? You said you did it. It's checked on the checklist, but I don't see it in the package and the field crew didn't get it, right? Okay, so let me show you. I think I got a slide in here. So that's what goes in a field package, right? Survey plan exhibit, written instructions. Oh, a couple things I didn't mention, a punch list. So I like to give the crew a punch list, especially on complicated surveys, just a punch list of what they need to do before they leave the site. That just helps them not forget anything, right? So I didn't mention that. Checklist. If you use field note forms, give them their forms, control, docs. All right, so here's what a survey plan exhibit looks like. So I do this goes in every one of my field packages. And once you get the template set up, it's really pretty easy. I can whip one of these things up in about 30 minutes, usually. So here's what goes on it. So mine are 11 by 17. I've got a viewport here with an aerial background. You know, usually it's just something from Bing Maps, or it's the USDA 1 meter orthophotography if it's a rural area, right? I define the mapping limits for the crew, okay? And I show existing control points. Okay, I give them a task punch list, usually goes on here that they can just check off if I don't have a separate punch list. I'll put descriptions of the existing controls. Sometimes I'll even put the control coordinates here, and it's really easy to do that in AutoCAD Civil 3D with a point table. Okay, over here I've got the job info, job name, job number, location, client point of contact, office contact, site access instructions. This is more than just the contact, right? So I'd give them the contact, but a lot of times you'll have working hour windows, so don't show up before 7, don't work past 3, you can't work during rush hour, whatever. If they're next to a railroad or a canal or an elementary school, like there could, if they got to get into a military base, there could be special instructions that they have to follow here, right? You got to bring up 2 forms ID or whatever. You can't drive your vehicle on this part of the site. It just changes job to job, but that all goes here. Then I have some brief notes about methods here. This is not a replacement for survey guidelines, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I do, put some brief notes here on how I want the survey executed, and then if there's any special notes about safety, that will go here. Okay, so this is what I call a survey plan exhibit. Okay, and I generally separate these out. I'll have one for topo and one for boundary. Usually I put the control on the topo, so I have a plan for topo and control, and then I'll have a plan for boundary. Okay. All right, let's see what I got on here next. Okay, so before we go to executing field surveys, let me show you guys a couple things real quick. See how I'm doing on time. I'm doing okay, we're at 30 minutes. So I just want to show you guys a couple things real quick. Let me go to my website. So I just want to let you guys know I've got we put some resources online this week that are related to what we're talking about. So if you come to my website, Redefine Horizons, go down to odds and ends. Okay, and then first of all, if you go to surveyor workshops, I've got a little page I put up here for this particular workshop. I've linked my slides, my speaker outline, and then we'll talk about a sample field survey timeline here in a minute if we have time. So I want to show you that. And then the other thing is we put our guidelines, these guidelines are a work in progress, but we put some guidelines up here. And so right at the top is the field surveying guidelines. Okay, so these are just guidelines that we're putting together, written instructions. I've got checklists. Okay, so let me just show you, for example, what does a field package prep checklist look like? Okay, so here it is. Like these are all the things that your project surveyor should be putting in your field package, right? Survey control, site access, topo. Okay, then I've got another sheet. I won't show you that. Okay, I've got a workflow here. What are the steps to prepare a field package, 4-step process? Who does what? Project surveyor, survey tech, what should be the work product when they're done. Okay, and then let me show you this. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on safety today, but I do want to talk about this because I think it's really important. So the roads are more dangerous than they've ever been. And one of the things that we're trying to put in every field package now is what we call a road safety review. And the whole point of this checklist is to make the project surveyor think about the work he's asking the field crew to do in the road, right? Because a lot of times what the project surveyor does, he's just like, go do my topo, go dip those manholes, go tie that center line on, right? And like, he's not thinking about safety. And I'm going to tell you, in my opinion, the office surveyor has the responsibility to make sure the crew works safely, right? Don't leave that on the party chief, right? The party chief's out there trying to get your job done. He's trying to do what you asked him. I'm not saying he shouldn't think about safety, but I hold the office surveyor accountable for making sure that the field surveyor got the instructions he needed to work safely. So here's what I want. We do this for every road that the surveyor's got to get in, right? I want to know the name of the road, what type is it, right? Is it a freeway? Is it a highway? Is it a city street? Is it a rural 2-lane road? What's the speed limit? I want to know what kind of median does it have? I want to know what kind of shoulder does it have? I want to know how heavy you think the traffic's going to be. I want to know how wide's the median, how wide's the shoulder, and then I want you to tell me, are we working in the shoulder? Yes or no? Are we working in the median? Yes or no? Are we working in the traveled way? Yes or no? Do we got to work in an intersection? Yes or no? Okay, then I want to know, what do you think the crew needs to do to work safely? Do we need a traffic control plan? Do we need traffic control for this job? Do we need a specific safety plan that's tailored to this job? So you should probably have a standard shoulder closure exhibit that your crews can use to set up their cones and signs. But like maybe if you're working in an intersection, your standard plan's not good enough. Maybe it needs to be tailored. Do they need signs, cones, and a spotter? This is a typo. Do you need a spotter, right? I tell you something, I've had 2 surveyors hit in the road in the last 5 years, and I've had at least 2, maybe 3 full backside tripod setups completely smoked in the road. 3 months ago or 4 months ago, I had a semi in Stockton completely smoke a heavy wooden tripod, a tribrac and prism, 30mm prism on a tripod on a quiet road in an industrial park with cones. And if there'd have been a man standing there, he'd have died. Okay, so you got to think about this. One of these sheets for every road goes in the field package. If I've got a crew working in the road and I go check my field package and this is not in there, I'm going for somebody's scalp, right? Like I had a job one time a few years ago. I got a call from Caltrans because my crew was out in the state highway, right? And I was running 10 or 15 crews at the time. I had no idea they were in the highway. You know, I had an LS that was working under me that was running the job. So I get a call from the guy at Caltrans, right? He's like, "Did you know your crew was out on the road? They were setting an aerial target. They were out on the highway, no cones, no signs. I don't even think they had their vests on." I come unglued, right? And I called my party chief. I said, "Why are you in a highway? And I don't know that you're in a highway." "I don't know, you know, the office surveyor gave me a target layout and told me to set the targets," right? So like, yeah, then I went and freaking scalped my office surveyor, right? This is a licensed guy, like he knew better, right? So this is a really important part of what's in your package. So that is on our website. And then if you go to YouTube and you just search for Redefine Horizons, this learning channel will come up. And I just want to show you guys, if you go to playlists, I've got a survey field work management playlist here, and it has 28 videos on it. And I talked to you about all kinds of stuff here: how to prep a field package, how to review your field work in TBC, how to adjust data in StarNet. I talk about how you can navigate your crews to remote locations using 3-word addresses. So lots of good stuff on here. I know you guys get tired of hearing my voice, but I just wanted to point that out. All right, so let's get back to our slideshow. So check out those online resources there. There's checklists and workflows for how to prepare for a field survey properly. Okay, so now we're talking about how do you execute field surveys. Okay, and I want to just walk you through my basic 4-part workflow for how to execute field surveys. And I'm going to go kind of quick because I'm running out of time. I knew that was going to happen because I talked too much. So here's the 4 steps. They should do a pre-survey site walk, no tools. I want to know that crew chief walked that site with that Robin. Right? That is a really, really, really important part of educating your rodman, right? Make your party chief do a site walk with the rodman, and the party chief should be explaining his thought process to the rodman. Okay, rodman, here's where I'm going to set my control. Here's why. Here's why we're going to tie that manhole. Here's why it's important. Here's how we're going to shoot that finished floor on that building. This is why we're going to do it the way we're going to do it, right? That education should be happening in the pre-survey site walk. No tools in their hands at that point, right? They should do some kind of safety check, right? Now I've been training a very young chainman. He's right out of high school, and he's been working with us part-time. And like every day at the start of the day, I take 5 minutes and I just talk with him about safety on that job site. Now that's not something I normally do with an experienced chief. That doesn't mean I shouldn't. But with this young man, I know it's super critical. He is not thinking about safety, right? You know, he's a young teenager. He's right out of high school. Like he's thinking about beer and girls and video games and fast cars, right? So like every day at the start of the survey, I got to tell him, hey, keep your head up, listen, right? Think before you cross the street, right? And it amazes me how often this kid has his head down, right? And it's because they're used to looking at their phone, right? And I got to keep telling them, hey, lift your head up, lift your head up, lift your head up, look around, right? So that's important, okay? Then they actually execute the field survey, okay? Then at the end of the day, I want them to do a post-survey site walk. Walk that site again with your rodman. I want them to take photos. I want them to make sure they covered the mapping limits. I want them to make sure they didn't leave any hazards. And I had a story at a place I worked, party chief, it wasn't my job, but a party chief popped a manhole cover. He left the manhole lid off the manhole. There were no cones up, and a car went into the manhole, right? That was an expensive boo-boo. Okay, so I want him to do a post-survey site walk. Take photos, make sure they didn't leave behind any hazards, you know, make sure if they dug holes in grandma's flower bed that they filled them in, that kind of thing. Okay. The other thing I'll mention here that I've started doing, which is new for me the last few years, is I also now do a video. So I'll walk the site. After I've done site photos, I will walk that site. Usually only takes 15 or 20 minutes, and I just do a 360 video, and I actually narrate that. You know, so I talk to myself as I walk through the site with the 360 camera, and I'm not talking, you know, I'm not humming my favorite country song. I'm like, okay, I'm on the north side of the site. Now I'm walking down the east side of the building. There's the manhole that we couldn't pop, right? And like those videos are treasure for the CAD tech that's trying to draft your topo, right? That's really important. So that's it, man. 4 steps, 4 basic steps for any field survey, right? And I'd love to hear from you guys. Email me or hit me up on the forum if you've got other steps that you think need to go in here. But this is my basic 4-step workflow for every field survey. All right, I got 4 minutes to get through this so we can have questions. So here's a quote. This is my quote. Responsible charge means you're making the decisions about how to execute field work. Without written guidelines, how are you doing that for 10 field crews at the same time? So I'm going to keep this short. I don't know how you guys are running multiple crews without written guidelines. I think what's happening as baby boomers retire is LSs are getting more and more responsibility, and their teams are getting larger and larger. And the reality is, if you're working at a big company and you're running 6 or 10 or 12 crews, you're probably not responsible charge of your field work. You're probably claiming that you are, but you're probably not. And so a key part of being able to make sure that you're supervising your field work is having written guidelines and holding people accountable to those guidelines, right? Because you can't be everywhere, right? And you can't be at that field crew's hip every time they're out. Okay, so let me just pause here real quick. And I'm gonna just show you what I mean by written guidelines. Okay, so if you just go to my site and go back to that guidelines page, I'm gonna just show you what some written guidelines look like. Okay, so I'm just gonna pull, oh, you know what? I saved them too. I forgot I got them on the folder. So here's my, no, that's not the one I wanted. I want the building ones. Let me show you guys the building ones, hang on. Okay, so here's my written guidelines for building surveys. Okay, and all my guidelines follow the same format. What are they? Why is it important? How's peer review done? Okay, and then I've got, all right, we've got 4 types of building surveys. We do type 1, type 2A, type 2B, and a type 3A and a type 4, okay? And then I tell you, on each building survey, what does that include? A type 1 is just the major corners of the drip line, you know, and then type 4A is type 4, sorry, is the most detailed. Here's what I want, all these different things, right? What kind of photos do I want? How do I need you to survey that building to make sure that we get a correct surface model, right? These go in a manual, and this manual gets handed to every field crew, right? And if you're not sure, like this seems like too much work, like check out the Caltrans survey manual, right? They got a lot of great stuff in there. A lot of great stuff. All right, let me show you, in addition to the written guidelines, I've got some diagrams. So we put some diagrams together for the crew, like, hey, what do I shoot for a type 3? What do I shoot for a type 1? What features do I shoot for a type 2? Right? And we got a picture here, and we're telling them this is what you shoot, right? Here's another one. Right? Here you go. Here's what I need you to shoot for the different types of surveys. Okay? And then we put together a little table. So here's a building feature table, right? It tells you, hey, for this type of survey, type 1, here's what I need. Type 3, here's what I need, right? So they can check this. And you got to train your field crews on this, right? You work for my company, I tell you to go out and do a type 3 building survey, you know exactly what I want, right? So I can hold you accountable. So those written guidelines are important. All right, I've got 1 minute and I'm officially out of time. Okay. Do your field survey field crews understand when they are about to deviate from your guidelines and why that deviation is necessary? So remember I said in the beginning, you can break the rules, but you got to know them first. I'm not saying that your field crews can't deviate from your guidelines, but they better know why, and you better know why, okay? And they can't know when they're deviating if you don't have guidelines, right? And write them down. Listen, if your guidelines aren't written down, they don't count, period. They don't count if they're not written down, okay? All right, so let's talk for a minute about reviewing field surveys. Every field survey gets reviewed, right, guys? You know, in a lot of places, they don't. So here's some questions related to responsible charge of field work and review of field surveys, okay? So this is, these are the questions you need to ask. Were the correct methods used, right? If you told your crew to tie the corners with a total station, did they tie it with RTN, right? And they'll do that because crews are lazy sometimes, right? So did they use the correct methods? You know, did they shoot that control point with a bipod? Did they use direct reverse observations? Did we get good results? Like this is a different question, right? Did they use good methods? Did we get good results? What were the check shots like, right? How did that traverse close? Does the data need to be checked or adjusted before it moves down the pipe, right? So hey, before that data goes to the drafter, do we need to do something with it? Do I feel like I was there in person, right? Based on the field notes, the photos, and your review of the raw data, do you feel like you were there in person? That's what this is, raw data review. Okay, if I was cross-examined in a court of law, could I answer questions about the field work that was done, right? And I'll tell you something, now that I own my own company, I will personally put my boots on the ground of every job I ever do from now on, because I want to be able to sit in a lawsuit and say that I was personally on the site as a surveyor in responsible charge. I think that's really important. Now, I'm not saying everybody's able to do that, but if you can't be there in person, you better feel like you were there in person by the time you're looking at that raw data. You better know exactly what that crew did, and you better have enough photos and video to answer questions like you were on the ground. Now, I'm not saying that you got to read every page of the field notes LS, or that you got to look at every photo LS if you've got trained staff to do that, but you better be able to go back after a job is done and get into that information and prepare yourself to answer questions. Okay. All right, so I got two more quick things I'm going to show you, then we'll go to questions. So if you're taking point data directly out of a data collector and onboard instrument software without making some effort to review the raw measurement data, you are negligent and should you have your license to practice revoked. That's my opinion. I know that's going to ruffle some feathers. Some people are going to be offended by that. Points are not measurements, gentlemen and ladies. Points are the result of measurement calculations. Your instruments don't measure points. They measure angles and distances and vectors, right? They measure ranges to satellites. You are missing so much if you're not looking at your raw data. If you're just taking a point file off an instrument, you are asking for a major disaster, right? Like, and look, I'm not flawless. Think about the story I told you in the beginning. I didn't look at how my party chief shot that benchmark. If I'd have saw Mon, I'd have asked some questions because I know better, right? The tech didn't know, and like I had to own that mistake because it was my responsibility to review the raw data that came back, and I failed to do that, right? I didn't even know that we didn't tie a second bench, right? That was a total failure on my part to be in responsible charge there and review the raw data. All right. Okay, before we go to questions, let me show you one other thing. So I do have a system I use to review field surveys, and so I want to show you that real quick, and then I'll tell you a real short, funny story. So here's my form to evaluate field surveys, and I just letter grade this, and this gets done on every field survey. So they come back, and I grade them. How'd you do on the instructions? A to F. Did you have the proper tools? A to F. Did you perform the work in a reasonable amount of time? A to F. Right? And I grade them A to F. Every survey they get graded, right? Now I'll tell you that here's the funny part of the story. So I started doing that. This is a few years ago. I started grading my field crews, and they were upset. You know, they were not happy. Why are we getting graded? And this isn't fair, right? And my office surveyors thought it was great, right? They were like drunk with power, right? And so one of my party chiefs said, hey, you know what? If we're going to get graded on our field survey, they should get graded on their handoff. And I thought about that for a minute, and I said, you know what? You're absolutely right. The office surveyor should get graded on their handoff. And so I started grading the office surveyors on their handoff to the crews, A to F with a form. And so it was like, that was fantastic. Like, look, now I'm grading the office surveyor. They're getting evaluated and being held accountable. Now I'm grading the field crew. They're getting graded and held accountable. Like, look, the point of that was not to make people feel stupid or to belittle them, right? It was to commend people that were doing a great job And it was to help people that weren't doing a great job to understand how I felt they weren't meeting the expectations, right? Okay, I've talked a lot and I'm a little bit over. Do we have questions? I think Kim was going to tell me. I usually don't get questions, but maybe we got some.
So one comment says that the link for the building survey written guidelines isn't working.
Yeah, it's pointing to the wrong one. I'll get it fixed. I'll fix it for you guys. Yeah, right now it's linking to the boundary survey guidelines. Sorry, I'll fix that.
And so if anybody has any questions, submit those in the chat or question box. Landon, will you provide your PowerPoint to the attendees?
Yeah, it's already on that webpage. It's linked as a PDF, so they should be able to get in and get to it.
Perfect.
Cool. All right.
That is all I'm seeing for now. Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
No problem, Kim. Thanks for hosting me.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.